Ukraine's sense of a common past, sense of a common present, its ability to forge unity out of plurality, ability to overcome the devastating effects of war, capacity to achieve a Euro-Atlantic future. And while together these themes help us understand not only how Ukrainians see themselves today, also how they envision their country's future, and I think how we can all be a part of supporting that effort. We've talked about that on some of the other panels as well. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge something about one of the concepts that will likely arise during this discussion, and it's come up in some of my side discussions as well, and that's the topic of resilience. I know it's been discussed already today, but it has become in some ways bittersweet and even controversial term in conversations about Ukraine. There's no question that Ukrainians have demonstrated extraordinary resilience throughout the war, but I've heard, and I'm sure it's been expressed here as well, many Ukrainians have also expressed discomfort with the rhetoric of resilience when it's used in ways that can minimize suffering, normalize sacrifice, or obscure the immense human cost of this conflict and war. That perspective is valid. Challenge me if you disagree. But I want to share one thing that I heard when I was in Ukraine just a few weeks ago at a prayer breakfast in Odessa. A member of parliament captured the sentiment powerfully. He said that people often describe Ukrainians as being made of steel, and they appreciate that, but truly Ukrainians are made of flesh and blood like all other humans. And so behind every story of endurance are individuals, families, communities, lives that have been profoundly affected by war. National identity is a huge part of that, and our speakers can all touch that in the different ways. And so they're they're falling over. But so to our virtual speakers, you just tipped on the iPad, but we still have you. And so with that, I'll turn it to our panelists to touch on these different aspects of Ukraine's national identity. In the end, we'll get a report card, so be ready to see where the progress or any regress is. And so, Professor Motyl, if I have you, I'd love to start with you. Your thoughts on Ukraine's established national identity.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be as brief as possible since we have such a large array of excellent speakers. I'd like to make 3 points that intersect some of the points that you made and some of the assignments that stand before us. The first is a point that I've made a number of times at this conference, and it's obvious and it's not original, but I do think it bears repeating, namely that wars are nation builders. That's a terrible thing to be. That's a terrible thing. One would prefer nations to be the product of reasoned thought, enthusiastic passion, and things like that. But in effect, wars play a very important role in forcing people, and again, I use that word consciously, in forcing people to choose sides. Until the war broke out in 2022, arguably until 2014, one could have been one could have sat on the barricade, not taking part in any discussion regarding one's identity. One could have been Russian, one could have been Ukrainian, one could have been a Ukrainian Russian, a Russian Ukrainian. One could ultimately say that I don't care who I am. Well, Putin has made that impossible. You're either on one side of the barricade or the other side. You're either with us or against us. And again, that may or may not be a good thing, but it's a reality. And the reality has had the consequences, had the effect of leading to a consolidation of Ukrainian identity, and in some instances to the formation of a Ukrainian identity amongst those people who lacked one, and those who had a Ukrainian identity. Their identity has arguably been consolidated. So as terrible as the war is, and it is of course a terrible thing, it has had this one very important, very significant, and to my mind, long-lasting consequence, namely the consolidation of Ukrainian identity. I'd like to make 2 more points. One is, the second one, or the first one rather, is this. Due to the fact that the war is such an overwhelming ontological presence in Ukraine, in the feelings Ukrainians have about themselves, the past, the present, the future, I'm going to suggest, if you like, I'm going to predict, that once the war ends, and it will of course end, and I personally believe that it's going to end with the Ukrainian victory, but that's my third point. Once the war ends, the war will become the core leitmotif of the Ukrainian national narrative. What's striking about that narrative, I mean, it's been in existence arguably since the 40s, 50s, maybe perhaps even since the 20s, and before that, but certainly in the time that the Ukrainian, an independent Ukraine has existed, it's been very difficult for people, writers, poets, academics, policymakers, and others, to form and fashion a coherent identity, a coherent national narrative. People emphasize different things for good reason. I mean, there's no reason why people should agree. But the war and its overwhelming presence in the lives of so many Ukrainians, of all Ukrainians, the price that Ukrainians have paid for what I believe will be victory, does mean that the war will serve as that, as I said, that leitmotif, the core element of the Ukrainian national narrative, arguably for a long time, certainly for a generation or two. That's good. It's going to serve, on the one hand, it will be a reminder to people of the horrors of war. That's always a lesson that one needs to be reminded of. But at the same time, it will remind Ukrainians of the fact that they did survive, that they were resilient, that they actually won. And one of the striking things about Ukrainians' national narratives, as I'm sure all of you know, is that they tend to be focused on defeats. Kievan Rus was overwhelmed by the Mongols. Mazepa lost at Poltava. Khmelnytsky was ultimately defeated. World War I was a chaotic catastrophe. World War II was no better. Here, I think Ukrainians will be able to deal with something very different, namely a victory. And that victory will serve, as I said, as this kind of anchoring element within the emerging Ukrainian narrative, which of course will have important consequences for Ukrainian identity. Final point is this. I do believe that Ukraine will win. By that I don't just mean survive. I've been arguing for 4 years that survival is a victory and stalemate is even more of a victory. But I do think Ukraine is actually going to win. Will it reconquer all its territories? I don't know. But I do believe that it's going to win this conflict, this war, in a way that qualifies as more than merely surviving and more than simply achieving a stalemate. What that means, and you can see elements of this already, what that means is that Ukrainians will have reason to be proud of their identity. There's been a lot of, one noticed this in the literature, in the proclamations, even in the national hymn, Ukraine is not yet dead. There's a kind of glorification of victim status. And of course, given the fact that Ukrainians have lost so many battles, that's perfectly understandable. But this will give Ukrainians an opportunity. The war, the victory in the war, will give Ukrainians the opportunity to move from victim to hero and heroine, which I think is going to be a fundamental shift, will produce a fundamental shift in the way Ukrainians think about themselves. But it would also lead to a fundamental shift in the way Ukrainians behave vis-a-vis their partners and other neighbors. For the last 30 or so years, many Ukrainians, certainly many Ukrainian policymakers, have approached the West with hat in hand. After the victory, they won't need to do that. They're not doing that already. One senses that they've developed a backbone, that they know who they are, that they are actually worth something, that they don't need to beg for assistance, they can demand it. So we're going to see a different Ukraine. A Ukraine that's going to consider itself to be equal of the Europeans. I think that's a good thing. I think it's obviously a good thing for the Ukrainians, but it's also a good thing for the Europeans, since they will finally be able to shed their feelings of superiority vis-a-vis East Europeans in general and Ukrainians in particular. And I'll end on that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir. I hope you can hear the clapping in the room. Great points, and I welcome our other panelists' reflections on that as well. But now I want to turn to Robert McConnell, and I'm especially interested in your thoughts on this move from victim to hero. But Bob, you first encountered Ukraine in the 70s, and when you think about Ukraine today, what changes in the country's sense of identity, purpose, and nationhood strike you as the most significant, both in Ukraine and in the diaspora?
Well, my perspective is one from being here in the United States, a non-Ukrainian. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, a good part of it, if Ukraine was mentioned, even mentioned, it was because they were anti-Semites. That was what was in the newspapers, if it was mentioned.
I think that I do think overall the narrative has shifted, but occasionally the questions of anti-Semitism still come up. And so when I'm asked about that as someone who's not Ukrainian but is regularly in Ukraine, I just point people to hear from the rabbis, the chief rabbis of Ukraine, listen to them, see them, religious Jews fighting in the army. And then recently I took a group to the Jewish cemetery in Odessa, which had been hit by Russian drones 3 times. And so point to that. And so I think it has overall changed, but still the work of everyone here in responding to that is important. Enough with me. Do we have Paul online?
We're still trying. I'm doing it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well then,
Yeah.
okay. Oh yeah, I would love to turn to you and hear your perspective on all of this. And as I was saying earlier, your organization's name is a perfect fit, Ukrainian Voice. And so, tell us what the Ukrainian Voice is, and let's assess the identity and how it may be changing. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you very much, actually, to bringing the question of national identity into the table. Because when we were discussing and listening to previous panel discussion and wondering how strong Ukraine is, how can Ukraine conquer the biggest military country in the world, how can Ukraine overcome the devastating effects of the war, we find the answer in the fundamental thing, which is our strongest asset, strategy asset of a country, is the national identity. And when we look at the national identity in its core, Ukrainian national identity, it finds its roots in the values, in democratic values of human rights, dignity, freedom, and at the same time, rule of law. When we look back into Ukrainian history, and I'm thanking you for bringing this also into the table, and thanking our People's Deputy, Mr. Volodymyr, for also sharing the experience of how the propaganda machine was working against Ukraine all this time. And nevertheless, today, Ukrainian history is again fighting for its truth, but with a weapon in our hands. When we look at Ukrainian phenomena, we are also asking, how is it possible that the nation is going through this kind of a struggle? Why they are having this struggle for independence? I'm traveling around the world right now with the advocacy campaigns, talking about Ukrainian democratic values, talking about Ukraine defending democratic values, talking about the consequences to the water resources, to the environment, talking about the 350 years of continuous struggle for independence, for freedom, for democratic values, and people are asking me about the phenomena of Ukraine. And I'm explaining them, yes, we are a nation of the millennium history. We are a nation in which Princess Olha was ruling the country and establishing education and legislation long before in Europe Elsewhere in the world, the female leadership was recognized. We are the nation which was able to resist the Mongol invasion, nation able to build the democratic values within Cossacks era. In the United States, we are visiting with the advocacy campaign and a book of Ukrainian lawyer, political activist, who in 19,000 wrote about independent Ukraine. It's a fundamental work which raised up generations of young Ukrainians to fight for their freedom. He was explaining how is it even possible that we have suppressed culture, that we cannot speak our own language, that books can be published in Ukrainian. And it was 126 years ago. We have translated this work into English, and we have a goal to translate it to United Nations languages and go around the world and explaining to key decision makers the phenomena of Ukraine, which lays in its history. And at the same time, I want to also say about the Ukrainian ability to conquer those consequences of the war we have right now, and at the same time, why it's possible. And today we were mentioning the unmanned systems, we were mentioning the drone industry. And I also have an honor to show you the patch of the first military voluntary unit who in 2022, in June 2022, were first to use the FPV drone kamikaze and target our enemy. And this is something what we were relying on in 2024 and 2025, the unmanned systems and the military opportunities, military production that we are capable to make ourselves. Because Ukrainians have seen in the history that there are times when your friends, your allies around the world close eyes that someone decides that your nation does not have a right to exist. And I had an honor to be in Lithuania on a Congress of Mercy last week. And it was my first time in Vilnius, and I was impressed how by the Lithuanian flag, how by the European Union flag, there is also a flag of Ukraine and Belarus. And today when we talk about forging unity out of plurality, it's important to talk that we have unity within Ukrainians. We are building a stronger unity within Ukrainians in Ukraine and abroad. And big thanks to Ukrainian diaspora working so hard throughout all these decades to advocate the right of Ukraine. And it was so inspiring to see in another country, in Vilnius, the solidarity of a nation on each of the institutional buildings, businesses, residential buildings, our flag. And I can tell that Ukrainian flag today is a flag of safety, a flag which marks a safe territory, a flag which marks there is a freedom of speech, a flag that marks there is a freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of consciousness, as the Organization for Defense for Freedoms of Ukraine declares. In nowadays, it's important also to talk about our ability to go through the Euro-Atlantic integration. And I can convince you that it's already embedded in Ukrainian society, but at the same time, it's also written in our constitution, it cannot be changed. And civil society in Ukraine is working their best to make possible to go through the legislation processes, reforms, as quick as we can. We are becoming giving our shoulder of civil society to the government to be able to go through the Euro integration. And it's also important to mention the great support we have from our partners in the humanitarian intervention and also the early recovery. And today, when we are looking at this war, we understand that this is not a war of 12 years, as Michalowski was writing. It's already a war of 350 years. And when I'm asked, do you think the war is ending this year or next year? I'm laughing as Volodymyr Zelensky is. It's a question, what we call war. Yes, today is a Russian war against Ukraine, but killing Chernobyl, killing Ukrainian dissidents and poets during the Cold War, was it war against Ukraine? Yes, it was. Forbidding Ukrainian language at school, was it war? Yes, it was a hybrid war. And at the same time, when we are standing on this momentum on the history, it's very important to form unity of the democratic world and give Ukrainian people and Ukrainian youth and Ukrainian leaders from the civil society to stand up and to fight the worst enemy in the world we could ever imagine, as we are the ones who are standing in the age of light and darkness. Thank you.
Your organization has a very fitting name, as I think you are a great voice for Ukraine. So thank you for that.
I will add a note that we, as UA Voice, we form an alliance of NGO sector in Ukraine, and our mission is to Ukraine voice to resound loudly. This is what we are doing every day.
Thank you for that. All right, Diane, I'd love to turn to you for your thoughts on this topic.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. Excellent remarks. As people know, I'm not Ukrainian, not even an ounce of Ukrainian blood, but I grew up in the U.S., immigrated to Canada, and have a lot of friends among the Canadian diaspora, which is enormously successful and punches way above its weight, economically in every aspect. So I became interested and I learned about the customs and the food and the culture and became a journalist. And when independence came along, I was over there right away to cover the story. And so I've been back and forth to Ukraine dozens of times as an outsider and looking at it as one of the most incredible geopolitical historical journeys in the modern era. And you know, it's really quite phenomenal. Now, in 1991, it was obvious that they were orphaned. They didn't know capitalism, they didn't know democracy, but Kravchuk was president, he was a good person, he tried, and then the next president was a bad guy. And then the backsliding into corruption and Russian-style government and oligarchy and crooked elections and bribery seemed to take root again. And I think this got the Ukrainian public very concerned about all of this. And I think what's interesting is that the Ukrainians, from the ground up, joined forces in favor of joining Europe rather than being pulled back into Russia, because of values and also because of safety. And then the world saw two incredible street revolutions, gigantic revolutions, because even though the Soviet Union had been brutal for ages against Ukraine and all the other countries, Ukrainians, probably because of their personalities, their churches, their agrarian roots, stuck together and had the most coherent, cohesive, powerful civil society in the former Soviet Union. And by going on the streets and having the revolutions, and they joined forces, and then the rest, of course, is history, because all of this was fighting corruption and crooked elections. But by 1997, the first truly free election was staged. Zelensky won, and the Russians said, we've had enough of this. And the rest, of course, now we see unravel in this awful war. Another thing I noticed as an outsider coming there to cover the political situation, I'm also a business writer, And I realized and met the most brilliant technology people. I've spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley that I'd spent since I've been to Silicon Valley. The educational level, the education of females, the quality of the education, the emphasis in schools of hard sciences and hard maths made it very obvious to me there was a talent base in the country that was amazing, and I got involved in a software business with some of these Ukrainian geniuses, and there were lots of them, and I wrote about them. It was an extraordinary thing. And of course, that brings us now to the war. And the unity, the incredible unity of Ukrainian people, the unique ability to join forces without being forced to, go on streets, make changes, fend off all of this, now leads us to being attacked by the enemy and mustering the forces of probably the most I think it is the most educated country in all of Europe, but certainly the most technologically advanced country perhaps in the world. It was the Silicon Valley. It was the Manhattan Project. The atom bomb for Russia was invented and developed in Ukraine. The aerospace industry, the aviation industry. And so all of these brains, and Zelensky became president. His father was a famous computer scientist. And Zelensky was the first leader in history to appoint a minister of digital warfare. And the result is that they've taken their brains and overcome their weaknesses in manpower and in weaponry and reinvented warfare. They have essentially turned their war into a video game, and they are winning. They're also suffering, but it is an incredible story. I mean, it's a miraculous story. But now what do we have? We have a country that's been extremely damaged by this. Unified, yes. Amazingly unified and collaborative. But, you know, the biggest number of deaths in a war or refugees since the Second World War. And, you know, there's millions of Ukrainians that are mostly women and children that are not living in Ukraine. Now what will happen is this war will end. I hope sooner rather than later, but I don't have a crystal ball. But clearly, the world is working hard to bankrupt Russia and drive out Putin. He's a monster. And, you know, it's important to know that even though all this is going on, I really feel, and so do Ukrainians, that they're going to pull it together. And it's interesting that Europe has come through with helping pay for the weapons the Americans didn't want to anymore and so on. But, you know, it's today, despite all these awful problems, the European Union agreed to admit Ukraine into the first stage of membership. So the Maidan won. Ukraine will be part of Europe. And that brings me to tears. So what happens next? There will be some kind of stoppage, and the diaspora and Ukrainians will pull together and rebuild their country. And the country will also prosper because Ukraine has, I think, shown to the world how talented it is, that it will become partners with its allies instead of dependents of its allies. And so I'm extremely optimistic, and I hope we're at the beginning of the end. So those are my remarks.
Can you hear them clapping for you? Okay, good. Thank you so much, Diane. I just want to also applaud all of your writing for years, bringing the stories about Ukraine to international audiences. So thank you for that. Do we have Paul online?
No.
Okay.
We do not.
All right. I'd like to turn to you on one of the trickier aspects of this. It was just mentioned by Diane. There are millions of Ukrainians abroad. Also, there are different experiences within Ukraine, of course. those in the armed forces, those in different regions. I'd like to ask your thoughts on how the different experiences throughout the war impact the sense of national identity.
When we think about national identity, thank you for this question. It's very important to understand that it was always a target of Russian war against Ukraine. And every time they were trying to spread diversity among the society and make us conquer East and West, in the military, not in the military. Family staying in Ukraine, family left Ukraine. And I can say that this is something what the aggressor was using for decades, also during the Cold War, also talking about the people who left Ukraine during the Soviet time and people who were staying in Ukraine. And of course, each sense of living is impacting the national identity. But the most important thing is that Ukrainians still able to find unity, even though of all these issues that might appear because of different backgrounds people come from. And I can say that the thing which is making us more friendlier every time is waking up after the sleepless night of the rocket attacks in Kyiv is something when you remind yourself there is no place for argument. And today, as was mentioned also about Urina, the consequences of the informational warfare, and nowadays Telegram is also an instrument of Russian propaganda, of spreading news and disinformation, spreading and making the artificial conflict between civil society, volunteers, people in the military, people are not in the military, people who are mobilizing people for the military. There are a lot of things to get better in Ukraine, of course. Being a post-Soviet country for such a long time and fighting oligarchs, fighting corruption is a challenge. Lots of things to get done. We rely on Ukrainian youth, Ukrainian leadership on that. Thanks for your US Department of State, we have a Future Leaders Exchange Program as a program for leaders from post-Soviet countries. But answering to your question, it influences national identity, but not that much to hit it and have bad consequences for nowadays.
Thank you very much. Professor Motil, I'd welcome your thoughts on that question as well.
Well, look, in every nation, whichever time in history or today, you will find a multiplicity of views on politics, religion, society, economics, and so on. I mean, every nation, even the Swiss, who are always viewed as being homogeneous, is heterogeneous. Diversity is part and parcel of every nation, of every collective, of every group. What the war does, or at least what the war is doing and will continue to do, this in any case is my suggestion, is it provides a unifying theme. I call it a leitmotif. You can call it anything you like, but it's a unifying theme, something that is so obviously important to every single person in the nation, in the country, that it will frame identity and induce people to pursue a certain kind of narrative style. I'm not suggesting that this will be the case forever, but a generation or two, possibly longer, is certainly very possible. I mean, if you look at British literature in the aftermath of World War I, or German literature, or American literature, a lot of it was framed by the experience of the war, and that contributed to the development of these various national narratives. In the case of the British and the Americans, arguably good narratives. In the case of the Germans, unfortunately, bad narratives. But nevertheless,